The request came in on a frequency the compact hadn't used in 60 years. Not a dead frequency. Not an abandoned one. A reserved frequency, set aside at the founding of the compact's emergency communication framework for a category of transmission that the framework's architects had hoped would never be necessary and had prepared for anyway, with the specific pragmatism of people who understood that hoping something never happens and preparing for it anyway were not contradictory positions. The frequency was designated for one purpose only, documented in the compact's foundational charter under a heading that translated, from the original Thorali, as Transmissions of Last Resort, Civilizational Distress. Senior relay analyst Prethova had been working the deep channel monitoring desk for 9 years. She had never heard the frequency activate. She had checked it was operational once a year as part of the standard infrastructure audit, and each year the audit had confirmed it was functioning and unoccupied, and she had filed the confirmation and moved on. She heard it activate at 0317. She sat upright. Her second action, after sitting upright, was to check whether the activation was a test. There was a testing protocol. The testing protocol produced a specific signal pattern, 3 pulses, 1 second apart, then silence. What she was hearing was continuous. She checked the authentication layer. The authentication layer confirmed the signal was originating from outside the compact's boundary, from coordinates that placed the source in a region of space that the compact's territorial maps labeled with a notation she had to look up because she had never needed to read it before. The notation said, Vrethkal Hegemony, Recognized Sovereign Territory, Active Non-Engagement Protocol. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called the duty commander. The duty commander activated the emergency response chain, and the emergency response chain, within 40 minutes, had produced a room full of people who were all looking at the same signal and all running the same calculation and all arriving at approximately the same answer, which was that the Vrethkal Hegemony, the mid-tier expansionist civilization that had been operating under a non-engagement protocol with the compact for the last 6 years. 6 years that had begun with a formal declaration of war against Earth that had been withdrawn before it became something worse, was transmitting on the civilizational distress frequency. And the transmission was addressed to Earth, not to the compact, not to the emergency response framework, not to the Compact Council or the Joint Authority or any of the formal institutional bodies that the civilizational distress frequency existed to contact. The header of the transmission, once the duty commander's team had decoded the authentication layer, was explicit, asterisk for the attention of the Earth Governance Council. Urgent. Civilizational distress. Please respond, asterisk. The duty commander's name was Orvathsal, and she had been in emergency response for 19 years, and she had handled situations that the standard operational framework did not cover. And she had never encountered a situation where a foreign civilization had bypassed the compact's entire institutional structure to transmit a distress signal to a single member species on a frequency reserved for the most serious category of emergency communication. Get me the Earth liaison, she said. It's 0317, her deputy said. Get me the Earth liaison, she said again. The Earth liaison's name was Counselor Adara Solis, and she answered the call in the specific state of alertness that Orvathsal recognized in people who have trained themselves to be functional faster than biology usually permits. She listened to the summary without interrupting. When Orvathsal finished, there was a brief pause. The Vrethkal, Solis said. Yes, Orvathsal said. On the civilizational distress frequency. Yes. Addressed to Earth. Specifically and exclusively to Earth, Orvathsal said. No compact header. No institutional routing. The authentication layer is valid. This is a genuine hegemony transmission. But the addressing is, she paused, because the addressing was something she was still processing, personal. Solis was quiet for a moment. What does the transmission say? We haven't decoded the body yet, Orvathsal said. The header authentication took priority. We wanted Earth liaison present before we proceeded. Another brief pause. Proceed, Solis said. I'll be at the relay center in 12 minutes. She arrived in 10. The body of the transmission was 43 seconds of audio and 19 seconds of supplemental data. The audio was in Vrethkal standard, which the Relay Center's translation system handled adequately but not perfectly. Vrethkal standard was a formal language that carried significant weight in specific word choices, and the translation system was calibrated for diplomatic Vrethkal rather than the formal register this transmission appeared to use. The translation team spent 6 minutes working through it before the lead translator, a Serenthi specialist named Velreth who had spent 2 years in the hegemony's territorial boundary before the non-engagement protocol was established, said that the body was ready. Orvithsal looked at Solis. Solis nodded. Velreth read the translation. The room listened. When Velreth finished, no one spoke for approximately 45 seconds, which was, in a room full of emergency response professionals, a very long silence. Then Solis said, "Play it again." They played it again. The transmission said, in the careful formal register of Vrethkal that Velreth had spent 6 minutes calibrating, that the Vrethkal hegemony was experiencing a civilizational emergency of the category that the Compact's foundational charter designated as existential threat, not a military emergency, not a resource crisis, but the specific category of threat that the charter's architects had defined as a situation where a civilization's continued existence as a distinct entity cannot be guaranteed without external assistance. It said that the hegemony's own resources and the resources available through standard compact emergency channels were insufficient to address the threat's scope and timeline. It said that the hegemony had reviewed all available options and had determined that one potential source of assistance existed that had not been exhausted. It said that the hegemony was asking Earth, not the Compact. The transmission used a specific Vrethkal formal phrase at this point that Velreth had taken the longest to translate, because the phrase was archaic and carried connotations that standard diplomatic Vrethkal had largely abandoned. The closest translation, Velreth said, was, "We are coming to you because you are the only ones who might understand what it means to ask this." The 19th seconds of supplemental data were coordinates. Specifically, coordinates for a meeting location in the buffer zone between Compact territory and the hegemony's outer boundary, and a proposed meeting time 48 hours from the transmission's timestamp. The room was quiet again after the second playing. The Vrethkal, Orvithsal said, to Solis. She said it the way you say a name when you're confirming that the name is the same name you think it is and you need someone to confirm it with you. The Vrethkal hegemony. Who declared war on Earth 6 years ago? Whose declaration we helped broker the withdrawal of, Solis said. She was looking at the supplemental data coordinates on the Relay Center's display. Yes. They've bypassed the Compact's entire institutional framework, Orvithsal said. They've transmitted on the most serious emergency channel the Compact operates. And they've addressed the transmission to Earth specifically because she stopped. What do they mean, the only ones who might understand what it means to ask this? I think, Solis said, still looking at the coordinates, that they mean what they said. Counselor. Orvithsal turned to face her fully. The Compact has emergency response protocols for civilizational distress transmissions. Those protocols exist precisely for this situation. The Vrethkal bypassed all of them. Whatever they're asking, they're not asking through the mechanisms the framework provides. They're asking Earth. Yes, Solis said. Why? Solis was quiet for a moment. Because 6 years ago, she said, Earth was the species they declared war on. They looked at us and they saw something small and they decided to act on that assessment. She paused. And then the declaration was withdrawn, and we didn't pursue it, and the non-engagement protocol was established, and for 6 years nothing happened. She looked at Orvithsal. Whatever they're facing, they've reviewed all available options and determined that the Compact's standard channels are insufficient and that one potential source of assistance exists. And they decided that source was us. She paused again. They didn't come to the species they expect to help them. They came to the species they have the most reason to believe might not. Because we're the only ones whose decision to help or not help is actually their question. The room absorbed this. The meeting is in 48 hours, the deputy said. The buffer zone coordinates. I know, Solis said. I need to make a call. She made 2 calls. The first was to the Earth Governance Council's Security Advisory, because she was a compact liaison officer and the decision to respond to the transmission was not hers to make unilaterally. The call took 31 minutes, during which the room waited in the specific quality of collective suspense that a room produces when it knows a decision is being made elsewhere and the decision matters. When Solis ended the call, she looked at Orvithsal. Earth will send a delegation, she said. To the buffer zone, Orvithsal said. To the buffer zone. 48 hours. She paused. The council wants a compact observer present. Not participating. Present. I'll arrange it, Orvithsal said. The second call Solis made was private, and she made it from a room adjacent to the relay center, and Orvithsal did not know who she called or what was said. What she knew was that when Solis returned, her expression had changed in a way that was difficult to precisely describe. Not worried. Not resolved. Something between those two things, in the territory of a person who has just received information that has changed what the next 48 hours will require. The supplemental data, Solis said. The 19 seconds. The coordinates. Yes, Orvithsal said. Run a full analysis of the transmission's origin point, Solis said. Not just the frequency. The subcarrier data. Everything the authentication layer logged. We ran standard authentication, Orvithsal said. Run everything, Solis said. I want the full picture before the meeting. Orvithsal ran everything. It took 3 hours. What the full analysis produced was a subcarrier data package embedded in the transmission's authentication layer that was not part of the standard Vrethcal communication protocol and that the standard authentication check had logged as noise and ignored. It was not noise. It was a secondary transmission, much shorter than the primary, encrypted in a different layer, apparently intended to be found only by someone who was looking for it. Velreth spent an hour on the decryption. What it contained was not audio. It was a document, 41 pages, in Vrethcal formal register, with an authentication signature that identified the author as the hegemony's current administrative director, not the political leadership, the operational leadership, the person responsible for the hegemony's day-to-day institutional function. The document's title translated as, Context for the Request. Orvithsal read it. She read it twice. She took it to Solis, who read it in the relay center's briefing room with the focused attention she gave to things she needed to understand completely before she could decide what to do with them. When Solis finished, she said, "This changes everything." "Tell me," Orvithsal said. "The hegemony is not experiencing a threat," Solis said. "Not in the conventional sense. They're not under military attack. They're not facing resource collapse. They're not in political dissolution." She paused. What they're facing is a consequence of their own actions, specifically. The territorial expansion operations they've been conducting for the last decade have destabilized 3 of their own foundational systems: the ecological, the social, and the administrative. All 3 are in simultaneous cascade failure. The Compact's standard emergency channels can address 1, possibly 2 of these, but not all 3 simultaneously, and not at the speed the cascade requires. She set the document down. The administrative director's document says that the hegemony has 18 months before the cascade reaches a point of irreversibility. 18 months, Orvithsal said. 18 months, Solis said. And the document says that the director has been trying to get the hegemony's political leadership to address the cascade for 4 years. The political leadership has been managing the public information environment around it for 4 years. The population of the hegemony, 32 billion people across 17 systems, does not know. The room was very quiet. Why Earth? Orvithsal said. Of all the available options of all the compact member species with relevant capability, why did the administrative director embed a 41-page context document in a transmission addressed to Earth? Solis looked at her. Because the document describes something the director witnessed 6 years ago, she said. From inside the hegemony's institutional leadership structure. She was in that leadership structure when the declaration against Earth was made. She was present for the discussions. She watched the full sequence of events, from the declaration to the withdrawal to the non-engagement protocol. She paused. The document's final section is about what she observed during that sequence. About the Earth Council's response to the declaration. Not what the response looked like from outside, which is what the public record shows. What it actually was, internally, as she was able to observe it through the diplomatic channels that remained active during the negotiation. What did she observe? Orvithsal said. She observed, Solis said carefully, that the Earth Council never once, in the internal negotiations, framed the question as what can we do to them. The only question on the table from the first moment to the last was what outcome is best for the stability of the region, including theirs. She paused. The director said she had been in the hegemony's leadership structure for 20 years and had never seen an adversarial negotiation where the adversary's well-being was a genuine consideration. Not a diplomatic gesture. A genuine consideration. Another pause. She said she has spent 6 years thinking about why that was and what it meant. And she says in the document that when she identified the cascade and calculated the timeline and reviewed all available options, she found herself returning to a question she had been unable to resolve in 6 years of considering it. What question? Orvithsal said. Whether the species that asked what's best for them about an adversary that had just declared war would ask the same question about the same adversary asking for help, Solis said. The meeting in the buffer zone took place on schedule, 48 hours after the transmission. Earth sent Solis and 2 advisors. The hegemony sent the administrative director herself, a decision that was itself a communication, since directors of that level did not typically attend preliminary diplomatic contacts, and 2 members of her technical assessment team. Orvithsal attended as the compact observer, with the specific and explicit instruction that she was present to witness, not to participate. She witnessed. The buffer zone's meeting facility was a small, neutral station maintained jointly by the compact and the hegemony under the non-engagement protocol, staffed by a rotating crew of administrative personnel who were currently, at this moment, present in numbers significantly below normal because the protocol had been invoked to clear the station for this meeting. The meeting room was functional and plain, with a table that seated 8 and a viewport that showed the particular quality of darkness that exists between claimed territories. The administrative director's name was Charvel. She was older than Orvithsal had expected from the document's authority, and she moved with the deliberateness of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a long time and has become so accustomed to the weight that the carrying itself has become part of how she walks. She sat down across from Solis and she looked at the Earth Counselor with an expression that Orvithsal found, from her observer position, difficult to read. Not defensive. Not hopeful. The expression of someone who has prepared for every possible response and is now waiting to see which one arrives. You read the document, Charvel said. We read the document, Solis said. The pause. All of it. All 41 pages, Solis said, including the final section. Charvel looked at her steadily. And? Solis said, we have questions about the cascade assessment. Specifically the timeline for the administrative system and whether 18 months is the hard limit or a conservative estimate. Charvel blinked. It was a very small movement, and Orvithsal would not have caught it if she had not been watching carefully, but she was watching carefully and she caught it. The director had prepared for many possible first responses and this was not one of them. She had prepared for negotiation. For conditions. For the question of what Earth wanted in return. She had prepared for refusal and for the specific dignity required to receive refusal without breaking. She had not prepared for a technical question about the cascade timeline. It is a conservative estimate, Charvel said, after a moment. The hard limit is closer to 22 months. 22, Solis said. She made a note. That matters. The difference between 18 and 22 gives us a different approach to the administrative stabilization. Charvel looked at her. Counselor Solis, she said. Before we proceed to the technical discussion, I want to understand your delegation's position. Our position is that we have 22 months to address a 3-system cascade failure across 17 inhabited systems, Solis said. We should probably use them efficiently. That's not what I mean, Charvel said. I mean your position regarding the hegemony. Regarding the request. She paused. Regarding the history. Solis looked at her across the table. Director Charvel, she said. 6 years ago, your government looked at Earth and made a decision based on what you saw. The decision was wrong, and it was withdrawn, and we established a protocol, and for 6 years nothing happened. You've spent those 6 years watching a cascade failure develop in your own systems while your political leadership managed the public information environment around it. She paused. You spent 6 years watching that. And when you identified the point where the available options narrowed to one, you decided that option was us. Another pause. We're here. That's our position. Charvel was quiet for a long moment. That's all, she said. What were you expecting? Solis said. Conditions, Charvel said. Territorial concessions. Information exchange requirements. Acknowledgement of the declaration as a formal wrong requiring formal redress. She paused. I prepared for a negotiation. We're not here to negotiate the past, Solis said. We're here to talk about the cascade. Charvel looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable. In my document, she said carefully, I described what I observed 6 years ago. About your council's internal framing. Yes, Solis said. I described it because I needed you to understand why I chose Earth rather than the standard channels, Charvel said. I was not certain the observation was accurate. It was possible I had misread what I was seeing. She paused. I am now less uncertain. Orvithsal, from the observer position at the room's edge, watched this exchange with the attention she had trained for 19 years and felt something she did not have a precise word for in her professional vocabulary. It was not surprise exactly, because she had read the document and had had 48 hours to think about what this meeting might look like. It was something closer to the specific sensation of a long-held assumption quietly revising itself. She had been operating, without fully examining the assumption, with a model of how human diplomatic behavior worked, built from 6 years of institutional contact. The model was accurate for a large portion of what she had observed. It was apparently not complete. The technical discussions began. They lasted 3 days, because the cascade's complexity required 3 days of genuine engagement between Earth's advisors and the hegemony's technical assessment team, and 3 days of genuine engagement was what it received. Orvithsal attended every session in her observer capacity and took notes with the thoroughness of someone who knows the notes will matter later, and she watched, across 3 days, something that she had not seen in 19 years of emergency response work. She watched a civilization ask for help and receive it without conditions, and she watched the receiving of it do something to the civilization that asking could not have predicted. On the second day, during a break in the technical session, she found Solis at the viewport in the corridor outside the meeting room. She stood beside her, and they looked at the darkness between claimed territories, and she asked the question she had been carrying since the relay center. The question the director couldn't resolve, she said. Whether the species that asked what's best for them about an adversary would ask the same question about the same adversary asking for help. She paused. Did your council actually debate it? Was there a version where the answer was no? Solis was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. There was a version where the answer was no. It was a real version. It had real support. She turned to look at Orvithsal. The argument was straightforward. The hegemony made a choice 6 years ago. The cascade is a consequence of choices they've made for the last decade. There is a version of justice where consequences arrive and the people who created them experience them. But you came, Orvithsal said. We came, Solis said, because 32 billion people didn't make those choices. Their government did. And the cascade doesn't distinguish. She paused. The debate lasted about 40 minutes. It was serious. It covered every version of the argument I just described. Another pause. And then someone pointed out that we have a 32 billion person practical argument against collective punishment sitting in our own history, and the debate ended. Your own history, Orvithsal said. We've done this before, Solis said. From the other side of the table. We know what a civilization that made bad choices and is facing the consequences looks like from the inside, if you're one of the 32 billion who didn't make the choices. She looked back at the viewport. We know it because we've been it. More than once. She was quiet for a moment. That's what the director saw, I think. 6 years ago. She was watching a council that had been on the other side of every version of this question that exists, and she was watching us apply what we'd learned from being there. Orvithsal looked at the viewport. At the darkness between claimed territories, which contained within it the coordinates of 17 systems and 32 billion people, and a cascade failure that had 18 months of conservative timeline and 22 months of hard reality, and a 6-year-old declaration of war that had been withdrawn, and a non-engagement protocol that had held, and a 41-page document embedded in a subcarrier layer by a director who had spent 6 years watching and 6 years wondering and had finally decided to find out. What happens now? Orvithsal said. We go home, Solis said. We put together the response framework. We coordinate with the Compact's standard channels. This can't be a bilateral operation. The cascade is too large for that. She paused. And we tell the Compact Council what we're doing and why. The Council is going to have questions, Orvithsal said. Yes, Solis said. About Earth unilaterally engaging with the hegemony outside the standard framework, Orvithsal said. About the response being coordinated from Earth rather than through the institutional channels. Yes, Solis said. The Council is going to have those questions. And we're going to answer them. She paused. The director sent that transmission to Earth because she calculated that the standard channels couldn't respond fast enough and broadly enough to address the full cascade. She was right about that. The standard channels are designed for single-system emergencies. This is a 17-system simultaneous cascade. She turned to look at Orvithsal directly. We're not replacing the Compact's framework. We're doing what the framework exists to do, in a situation where the framework's mechanisms are insufficient on their own. That's not a violation of the framework. That's what member species are for. Orvithsal looked at her. She thought about 19 years of emergency response and every situation she had processed and every protocol she had applied and the specific situation 6 years ago that she had not been involved in but had read about afterward, the declaration and the withdrawal and the protocol, and the thing that the director's document described about the internal framing, the question that had never been what can we do to them. Counselor Solis, she said. Yes. The director's document. The final section. She described her uncertainty about whether her observation was accurate, whether she had correctly understood what she was seeing in the internal negotiations 6 years ago. She paused. I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The question about what's best for the stability of the region, including theirs, Orvithsal said. Was it actually the question on the table? Or was it the stated question while different calculations were happening underneath? Solis looked at her for a moment. It was the actual question, she said. You're certain? I was in the room, Solis said. For most of it. I was a junior liaison officer then. She paused. I watched the council debate what to do when an adversary declares war on you and then, for reasons that include the Compact's diplomatic pressure and the adversary's own calculation that the declaration was a mistake, withdraws it. I watched the debate about what the right response to that sequence was. She looked at the viewport. The council landed where they landed because the question they were actually asking was, what outcome, if we pursue it, produces a stable and peaceful situation going forward for everyone in the region? And the answer to that question was, establish a protocol, don't pursue grievance, leave a door open. And now the door is open, Orvithsal said. And now the door is open. Solis confirmed. The response framework took 3 months to build and 6 months to begin implementing. It was, as Solis had said, not a bilateral Earth hegemony operation but a compact coordinated multi-species response, because the cascade's scope required it. The Compact Council had questions, as anticipated, and the questions were answered, and the framework was endorsed, and the implementation began. Orvithsal filed her observer report 2 weeks after the buffer zone meeting, which was longer than the standard filing window and shorter than the time she had needed to process what she had witnessed. The report was 31 pages. It was thorough in the way that she was thorough, which was her most reliable quality. It covered every session, every exchange, every technical discussion, every break room observation. It covered the first exchange between Solis and Charvel in full, Because the exchange was the most important thing that had happened in the meeting room, and the most important things were the ones she was most careful to document accurately. The report's final 2 paragraphs were the ones that Orvithsal spent the most time writing, because the final 2 paragraphs were not about what had happened in the meeting room. They were about what the meeting room had produced in her own understanding of something she had been looking at for 6 years without fully seeing. She wrote, *, the hegemony's administrative director chose Earth as the recipient of a civilizational distress transmission because she had spent 6 years examining an observation that contradicted her institutional understanding of how adversarial negotiations work. She had observed a council that asked about the adversary's well-being as a genuine consideration, not a diplomatic performance, and she had found this inexplicable within her existing framework and had spent 6 years developing a new framework to explain it. The new framework she arrived at, described in the final section of her embedded document, is that Earth's council asked the question it asked because they had been on the receiving end of the same question in their own history, and they had made the experience of being there into something they didn't repeat. She wrote, I have been an emergency response professional for 19 years. I have processed thousands of transmissions on thousands of frequencies, and I have handled situations that no protocol covered, and I have believed, for 19 years, that I had a reasonably complete model of how member species behave in crisis situations. The buffer zone meeting revised the model. Not because Earth did something I did not expect. Councillor Solis's delegation behaved with complete consistency to the pattern the director had identified 6 years ago. The revision is in my understanding of what consistency means at that scale. It is one thing to extend good faith in a low-cost situation. It is another to extend it to an adversary who declared war on you, in a situation that costs significantly more than nothing, in front of the full compact observation apparatus, with the full understanding that the decision and its reasoning will be on record. The consistency across those conditions is not coincidence. It is not policy. It is something that the standard frameworks for analyzing member species behavior do not have a category for, and I am recommending that the Emergency Response Division consider developing one, *. She submitted the report. She went back to her desk. The deep channel monitoring system was quiet. All frequencies nominal. The civilizational distress frequency was dark again, unoccupied, doing what it was built to do, waiting for the situation that required it. She thought about 32 billion people who didn't know their cascade was being addressed. Who would know, eventually, when the stabilization operations became visible, when the administrative infrastructure began to recover, when the ecological systems began to respond to the intervention. Who would know that something had changed and would be told what had changed, and would have to live with the fact that the species their government had declared war on 6 years ago was the species whose response framework was holding the cascade back. She thought about what the director had said in the meeting room, that she had prepared for a negotiation and had received a technical question. She thought about the question that had been on the table 6 years ago, and the question on the table 3 days ago, and the fact that they were the same question, and the fact that the answer had been the same both times, and the fact that the director had spent 6 years unable to fully explain why. She thought that she understood, now, what she had been looking at. Not a policy. Not a calculation. Something older than either. Something a species builds when it has been through enough of its own history to know, from the inside, what it costs to be on the wrong end of a question no one is asking. Something that compounds forward across time in the way that all true things do, not through announcement or record or ceremony, but through the specific and irreversible fact of what the species does when the situation arrives and the calculation is real and the door is open and the question is whether to walk through it. They walked through it. That was the answer the director had been trying to find for 6 years. That was the answer the galaxy had not yet built a category for. That was the answer that 32 billion people were, right now, in some form they could not yet see, beginning to receive. It was not a triumphant answer. It was not a clean one. It was the answer of a species that had burned itself down and rebuilt and burned again and rebuilt again, for long enough and thoroughly enough, that they had learned something from the ash that no species learns any other way, that the capacity for harm and the capacity for help live in the same hands, and the difference between them is not strength, and is not intelligence, and is not history. It is the question you decide to ask when you have every reason not to ask it. and the discipline to keep asking it. Long after every